Mr. Assistant President, I have to hope that this government's repeal of the good and popular First Home Buyers Choice Scheme is a political stunt, because it is such an objectively bad policy position that a responsible government could never endorse it. Unfortunately, it is no benign political stunt. The regressive return of stamp duty and the move from land tax has individual and economy-wide effects. And even if the government won't listen to me, will the government listen to economists? Will the government listen to first home buyers? Firstly, I wanted to look at some of the public commentary around this. I think the reality is, and that has been spoken about by my colleagues on this side of the chamber, is that stamp duty is a bad tax. And these are the kinds of headlines that we see. Stamp duty is a bad tax, a terrible tax. Is it time to abolish stamp duty? A stamp duty cut may sound crazy now, but it's a bad tax due for an overhaul. Time to stamp out stamp duty. Abolish stamp duty. Let's be honest, stamp duty is a terrible tax killing economic growth and productivity. And my favourite that really sums this up in the ABC, New South Wales land tax and stamp duty debacle again shows how politics trumps policy. And that is the sad reality that we're seeing with this government. It's already been mentioned by the Honourable Christopher Rath, but the Henry Tax Review really has some choice words that we must heed. Stamp duties are a highly inefficient tax on land, while land tax could provide an alternative and more stable source of revenue for the states. Land tax is one of the most efficient means of raising revenue. Reforming land tax and conveyance stamp duty arrangements, along with the proposed changes to the taxation of rental housing and rent assistance, will go some way towards improving housing affordability. And really, Mr. Assistant President, isn't this what it is all about? It is about improving housing affordability and securing our state's financial position and growing our economy. That's what the Treasurer should be focused on. And now to the experts. The inquiry into housing affordability and supply in Australia New South Wales Productivity Commission submission in 2021 states stamp duty imposes costs on people at all stages of life. Growing families that desire to be closer to schools may face significant costs. Older Australians who own their home are less likely to downsize to more suitable housing. Another piece by the Grattan Institute. It is titled, New South Wales should swap stamp duty for a broad-based property tax. It's the title of the entire submission. It goes on to say that New South Wales has one of Australia's least efficient tax systems, with each dollar of revenue raised costing the economy 30 cents. The New South Wales government should abolish stamp duties and replace them with a general property tax. The economic gains from this reform would be large. Shifting from stamp duties to a broad-based property tax could leave New South Wales between $4.1 billion and $5.2 billion a year better off, according to estimates based on the excess burden of taxes. These are the cold, hard facts, and these are the facts that the Treasurer is unfortunately unwilling to accept. And this is why I suspect it is, in fact, a political stunt. The reality that this Labor government took its role in opposition far too literally and decided to oppose this policy simply as a political point of differentiation. Little did they think that in a minority government they would actually have to answer for their policy positions. I have still not heard one single reason why this is a useful policy in the long term. And if we have a responsible Treasurer who is committed to the long term, then he could surely see and listen to the experts, if not me, of how this will impact our economy and people over the long term. My suspicion is that this policy is actually a way to continue the sugar hit of stamp duty that the government will need to rake in at the expense of the good and the better long-term policies that we can be implementing. The reality is that we have been primed for a September budget full of cuts. And if this is a way to sugar hit the coffers of the government to make up spending in the next 4 years until they make it to the next election, then that is something that they are apparently willing to do. It's very concerning, Mr. Assistant President, that this government is acting at the long-term expense of the residents of New South Wales in favour of its own political prospects. And going back to this idea that there are macro and micro effects. So individually, it is very clear, it has actually been explained very clearly, the concept of choice. And I might refer to one of my favourite sources of explanation for definitions, Urban Dictionary. Choice is a word to describe a favourable situation, describing something enjoyable, top-notch, of utmost quality. It is choice. This is a choice policy that those on our side were able to implement. And unfortunately, the government refuses to accept the fact that this choice that has been offered to the residents of New South Wales has been taken up with great effect. If it were not a popular policy, why would people be choosing it? And this is where I go back to the idea that the only rationale that I can possibly think of that this policy would be implemented is that it strengthens the coffers over the short term at the expense of the long term. Because we hear from economists, we hear from the experts, that the reality is that land tax is an efficient way to tax and to continue to grow our economy. And I think the individual impacts, I mean, I don't know about those opposite, but I have been contacted about this by people in my age cohort. This is a tax that will impact young people particularly. And I just wanted to read out some of the messages that I've been getting, if I may. Stamp duty is an absolutely ridiculous and inefficient tax, not just for first home buyers, but the entire economy. The upfront cost is crazy for first home buyers, but it also doesn't make sense to me to make them pay that upfront rather than paying a tax over time and letting them invest that money for the return. And this is the kind of mood that I continue to get from someone who contacted me as a real estate agent who specialises in first home buyers. He said his clients will be hugely affected. And this is the reality of the property market in New South Wales, and particularly around Greater Sydney. The reality is that in areas with high rates of families, places like Sutherland, the median house price, we're talking about $1.4 million. In Parramatta, it's $1.1 million, Mr. Assistant President. And these are areas that should be desirable to live. We should be encouraging people to live in our suburbs, and we should be encouraging people to invest their money the way that they choose. And that is why the land tax, the optional land tax, was so popular. Going back to the macro of this, I think if we are to expect a government that is looking at the long term, if they thought that they would be in government for 8, 12 years, we would be thinking that they would be adopting policies that would be beneficial for people over that timescale. But it is clearly not the case. What is the case is that this policy is geared towards the next election. It is about making sure by September they have some dollars in the bank, because unfortunately, growing the pie, growing in the economy is not apparently part of the strategy that we're about to see. Instead, we have regressive taxes that will be imposed upon us forevermore. And I think when you consider the increase in the value of land and property prices over the last decade and more, the reality is that property prices will increase. So does that mean that stamp duty will continue to be waived for greater and greater prices of property? It's unclear how this is a sustainable tax in the long term. I would like to also mention that this is something that impacts women in families in particular, in addition to young people. I think when we're talking about women who want to enter the property market, particularly single women, we need to understand that choice should be at the heart of how they invest. And when we consider the government's policy, we think about the fact that investor owners are actually encouraged and incentivised to act under this policy. So somebody who may not wish to live in a property that they would get a stamp duty exemption for, they will buy that property for the benefit and then rent it out, and then themselves rent a property in the city. And this is a cycle that we don't want to see continue. We on this side of the House believe in property rights. We believe that the people of New South Wales should be able to afford and choose to buy in the manner of their wishes the property that they want to live in. We want to see people who are able to afford their own homes so that they can bring up their families in the manner in which they choose. And previous speakers have already referred to mobility. Unfortunately, with stamp duty, we reduce mobility. When we're talking about housing affordability, we want to make sure that the property market is expanded, that we have an increasing supply of homes, and in fact, that people who wish to buy a house are incentivized to do so when they need to downsize in addition to their first home. So people who are in a big house that they have brought up their family with, that they have had many beautiful memories in, with a big backyard, maybe a swimming pool if they're lucky, those people might not want the maintenance, they might not want the size, they might not want the rates that are associated with a larger property when their children leave and hopefully buy their own homes. But if they are disincentivized to downsize to an apartment or a terrace or some smaller home, then they will not do so. And we will see the increasing capacity of this larger housing stock being restricted because people are not incentivized to move out. So I still have not heard why this policy could possibly be good in the long term. I have seen in the evidence of people choosing to take up this policy of land tax that it is good for individuals, and I see no reason why this policy cannot be maintained with a choice of land tax or stamp duty as desired, and continue to, as the Honourable Chris Rath spoke about, continue to wind back stamp duty as a policy that exists at all. We want to get to a point where land tax is a fundamental part of how our tax system works. And I spoke about tax in my inaugural speech. I think wholesale reform is absolutely necessary. I also said that I am not a destinationalist, I am a directionalist. It is about making moves to ensure that these policies will become better over time, better for our citizens, better for our budget. And the land tax choice, the first home buyer choice scheme, is something that does that so clearly, and to see this regressive move is really so disappointing. It's something that I feel very passionately about on behalf of my own age group, but of course on behalf of the age groups to come who will be locked out of the property system with these kinds of measures. And of course we've spoken about that gap between the $1 million and $1.5 million house and property market, which is really an essentially huge part of Australia and New South Wales in particular, and Sydney even more so in that property market. So in the spirit of ensuring that we have good long-term policy, I urge the government to reconsider the repeal of this good and popular scheme. I urge the government to listen to the people of New South Wales who have chosen to enact the land tax first home buyer choice scheme in their own life, rather than having to work so much harder to pay for their first home their first home. And as the Honourable Scott Farlow spoke about, the fact that people are being outplayed by the market as much as they try to save, they will continually find that the increasing proportion of stamp duty and that cost is out of reach as time goes by. It is about ensuring that those people are able to actually get into the property market with their first home for the first time. So in the micro and the macro, I think it's clear that the first home buyers choice scheme was a positive for people in New South Wales. I think the government is acting in its own self-interest rather than in the interests of the people of New South Wales by repealing this. And when we when we get to a point where we actually have to vote on this, I will be very, very sad to see the government voting in favour, because it means that many of my friends, people in my cohort, young people, first home buyers, people fleeing domestic violence, there are a number of reasons that people would have chosen this first home buyer choice. To choose this land tax, they will be shut out, their choice will be removed. This political stunt will have repercussions for individuals and the budget for years to come. So, Mr. Assistant President, if the government will not choose to listen to this side of the House, if they will not listen to the thousands of home buyers choosing land tax over stamp duty, if they will not listen to the economic experts despairing of the progress achieved by the former government will be completely wound back, who on earth will they listen to?